in a quiet archive, preserved under controlled light and temperature. There is a fragment of a map, drawn in 1513. The parchment is worn, its edges uneven, its ink faded but still legible. At first glance, it appears to be, like many others from its time, coastlines, sketched in flowing lines, annotations written in careful script, oceans filled with decorative flourishes. But then, something begins to stand out. The coastline does not quite match the expectations of the era in which it was drawn. There are details subtle but precise that seem to suggest a level of geographical awareness that should not have been possible at that time. This map is known as the Peary Race Map, and it has been studied for over a century. It is often described as a compilation, a synthesis of earlier sources, brought together by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer. This explanation is widely accepted, and yet it introduces a quiet complication, because if the map is based on earlier sources, then the question shifts. What were those sources, and how far back do they go? The official understanding of early cartography is grounded in gradual discovery. Coastlines were mapped as explorers traveled. Observations were recorded, and over time, a more complete picture of the world emerged. Errors were common. Distortions were expected. Maps reflected both knowledge and uncertainty. This is consistent with what we see in many historical documents, and yet, in some cases, the level of detail seems to exceed that expectation. The Peary Race Map, for example, shows parts of South America with a degree of accuracy that has led some researchers to question how such precision was achieved so early. There are interpretations still debated that suggest portions of the map may correspond to landforms that were not widely documented until much later. These interpretations are not universally accepted. Many scholars argue that the perceived accuracy is coincidental, or that it reflects later projections being imposed onto earlier drawings. This is a reasonable caution, but the pattern does not end with a single map. There are other examples, scattered across time and geography, where early maps appear to contain details that are difficult to fully explain within the context of their creation. Some depict coastlines that seem oddly refined. Others include landmasses that do not align with modern geography, yet appear too deliberate to be entirely imagined. In certain cases, maps have been interpreted as showing regions beneath ice or areas that would not have been accessible to the explorers of the time. These interpretations are controversial. They are often challenged, and in many cases, alternative explanations are offered. Misinterpretation, artistic license, or the merging of incomplete data into a single representation. And yet, when viewed collectively, these anomalies begin to form a subtle pattern, not one that proves anything definitively, but one that raises a consistent question. How did early cartographers know what they knew? Because even if we accept that maps were compiled from multiple sources, those sources must originate somewhere. At some point, someone had to observe, record, and transmit that information. And in some instances, the level of detail suggests observation rather than speculation. Returning to the idea of compilation, it is important to consider how knowledge was preserved and transferred in the past. Information did not always move in a straight line from discovery to documentation. It was copied, translated, adapted. Maps were redrawn, sometimes multiple times, each version carrying traces of the one before it. Over time, the original source could become distant, even forgotten. What remained was the representation. This process can account for a great deal, but it also introduces uncertainty. Because if a map from the 16th century is based on a map from an earlier period, which in turn was based on an even earlier source, then the origin of that information becomes increasingly difficult to trace. It becomes layered, and within those layers, details can persist long after their context has been lost. There is also the matter of projection. Early map makers did not have access to the same mathematical tools we use today. Representing the world on a two-dimensional surface introduces distortion, and different projection methods can produce very different results. This complicates direct comparison between ancient and modern maps. What appears accurate in one interpretation may shift under another. And yet, even with these considerations, certain alignments remain intriguing, not conclusive, but noticeable. In some cases, coastlines appear where they should not yet be known. In others, landmasses are placed in positions that invite comparison with regions that were officially documented much later. The official explanations continue to emphasize caution. Coincidence? Interpretation. The human tendency to find patterns, and these are valid points, but they do not entirely remove the sense that something is being overlooked, because the question is not necessarily whether ancient maps are perfectly accurate, it is whether they contain fragments of knowledge that do not fully align with the timeline we have constructed, fragments that suggest awareness of places beyond what we assume was known. This does not require a dramatic reinterpretation of history. It does not require hidden civilizations or advanced technologies. It only requires the possibility that knowledge may have been accumulated, preserved, and transmitted in ways that are not fully documented. That information may have been lost, rediscovered, or partially retained across generations, and that what we see in these maps may be the result of that long and uneven process. There is also the question of intention. Maps are not neutral. They are representations shaped by purpose, navigation, communication, influence. What is included, what is emphasized, what is omitted, all of these choices affect how the world is depicted. So when a map shows a landmass that does not correspond to our current understanding, it is worth considering not only whether it is accurate, but why it was drawn that way. Was it based on observation, on reports, on earlier maps that are no longer available, or on something else entirely? As we move through these examples, the scale of the question begins to expand, from a single map to a broader pattern, from isolated anomalies to recurring themes, and gradually the focus shifts, not from what is known, but from what is uncertain, because uncertainty, in this context, is not a flaw. It is an opening, a space where further examination is possible, a reminder that our understanding of the past is built from surviving pieces, assembled into a narrative that is always, to some extent, incomplete. The maps remain. They are physical objects, created with care, preserved across centuries, studied and debated. They do not change, but our interpretation of them does. And as that interpretation evolves, so too does the sense of what they might represent. Not definitive answers, but questions that persist, questions about how knowledge was gathered, how it was shared, and how much of it has been lost. Because if even a small portion of these maps reflects information that predates our current timeline, then it suggests that there are layers of history we have not fully uncovered, not hidden in the sense of being deliberately concealed, but simply not fully understood. And perhaps that is the most compelling aspect of all, that these maps, drawn centuries ago, continue to challenge our assumptions, not by contradicting them outright, but by quietly existing alongside them, suggesting that the story of how we came to understand the world may be more complex than it appears, that knowledge does not always move forward in a straight line, that it can be fragmented, preserved in pieces, and rediscovered in unexpected ways. So when we look at these ancient maps, with their faded ink and uncertain origins, the question is not just what they show, it is what they remember, and whether, in those lines and shapes, there are traces of a world that was known long before we realized it, or perhaps a world that we have only begun to understand.